Okay, I think we'll get started now. We're just after the hour, and great to see people coming in for our webinar today. That is a partnership with Youth Rex and the KDE Hub, and we're glad you're joining us today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alice Schmidt-Hambidge, and I'm one of two scientific co-directors at the KDE Hub, and so glad you could join us in this busy December. And just a few days left before hopefully you have a break in your busy schedules, but thank you for joining us here. We're thrilled you can be here for another KDE Hub webinar. Before we get started today, I would like to situate ourselves in the land that our webinar is hosted on today. And although we're joining virtually today, our team is situated at Renison University College, and we're affiliated with the University of Waterloo, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Attawandaron peoples on the Haldimand Tract. This land was promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from mouth to source. The Grand River runs through southern Ontario, and we recognize that you as participants today live in areas across this country. Feel free to say hello in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're zooming in from, and let us know where and what organization you're with today. As a mental health promotion organization at the Hub, we strive to support mental health and well-being in a way that respects and incorporates Indigenous perspectives and experiences. We acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization and systemic inequities on Indigenous mental health, and we're dedicated to fostering an environment of inclusion, respect, and healing for all communities. We recognize that a lot of work remains to be done in advancing decolonization and reconciliation. Thanks. Great to see people posting in the chat where you're from. Hi there. So we would like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the webinar and the recording on the KDE Hub website. And we also invite you to post your questions or comments in the chat. And you can also ask them during our question and answer session after the presentation. And there will be time following the presentation by Youth Rex. So we're pleased that you're here today to learn more about Black youth well-being, and we've got some great resources that Youth Rex will be sharing today. The kit for centering youth or Black youth well-being is on our agenda today, and we have a couple folks here from Youth Rex that are joining us, and we will be passing the microphone over to them. And first we have Dr. Cyril Cromwell, and he is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Youth Rex. And Youth Rex stands for Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. And they're located at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Cyril is a strategist, an educator, and community-based researcher dedicated to advancing equity in the social services director. And we also have Katie Rogers, and she is the managing director at Youth Rex, who will be here joining us today. So we welcome you both, and we'll pass the microphone over to you, Cyril. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. I'm so glad that you're able to join us today. I'm really excited to share this resource, Centering Black Youth Wellbeing. We have a number of resources that we've launched, and I would love for this webinar to be interactive, to be engaging, and just to hear from the knowledge in the room so that we can all be enriched by that. And so you'll see on the screen a brief agenda of our goals of what we want to accomplish, but I'm also interested in what brought you to this space, what brought you to this webinar. So in the chat, if you don't mind, if you can kind of just share what's your interest, what are you kind of hoping to get away? Though we have a brief time together, I do hope that it's enriching. And if you could just take a moment right now to share that, that would be really, really helpful. We are based at York University, but this is a provincial project. And actually, with this Public Health of Canada grant, we're national now. So we've been rolling out this project, and we're really excited to share these resources. So please just share in the chat, and I would love to see what people are saying. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so let's start with just a little bit about YouthRex. So the Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange was formed to support the youth sector in Ontario by transforming knowledge into positive impact. So what does that mean? It's looking at evaluation, research, to inform our programs, improve our programs, and also to provide some capacity building, filling some gaps for our critical practice to make sure that we're leveraging and doing the best that we can for young people. And so there are four primary ways that YouthRex does that. Firstly, through knowledge exchange. So we have a website or a knowledge hub that YouthRex has been producing over the how many years we've been around? 10 years plus. So the Knowledge Hub is a great resource for you to check out. We have evidence briefs, we have fact sheets, infographics, ways that are interactive to help people access knowledge. Sometimes that's not even that accessible, like literally physically by being behind payment gate walls and things like that, right? So that is the knowledge exchange. We also have Learn by YouthRex, which is very close to my heart. This is our online learning platform. We have certificates, we have workshops, and I'll include some of the links in the chat as well. And we have youth program supports. At this time, we have our toolkit to support programs in doing evaluation, but YouthRex has also provided some direct support in the past as well when it comes to direct evaluation. And of course, we have our community engaged research where we are doing primary research. And we have a really exciting project that's going to be launching not too long from now called the Ontario Youth Compass. So please look out for that. We have some really interesting findings to share with that. So that is a broad background on YouthRex itself. Maybe we can launch a poll now. Just before I get into the crux of the conversation today, I'm curious about how many people have used resources specifically from the kit for centering Black youth well-being. Have you used our certificate? Have you engaged with our virtual cafe, which is our chat forum? Or have you perhaps also utilized any of our knowledge resources, or our calling cards, which is a new feature that I'll talk about today as well? If you could just respond to that, that would be really helpful. And thank you, Katie, my colleague, that's joining us today as well, supplying all those links that I hope you'll take a moment to check out as well. So I'll just give a minute for people to respond so I can hear, have you been able to utilize any of the resources from the kit for centering Black youth well-being? And this just gives me a bit of a gauge. Okay, I think the results. Okay, this is great. So this is going to be a very useful webinar, obviously, for many people, because this is going to be a lot of new information in terms of what these resources provide. Okay, so let's move ahead. So when we're talking about the context of anti-Black racism, and in fact, I'm going to ask this question to the people here. And if you would like to unmute, I think that's totally fine. Let's have a conversation. What does anti-Black racism look like in Canada or a particular Canadian context? Is there anything unique about how racism and anti-Black racism specifically may be experienced or expressed in a Canadian context? Any thoughts on that? Please feel free to unmute or throw your comment in the chat. Any comments? How does anti-Black racism look like in the Canadian context?
It it seems like to me, like just kind of from what I hear, even in my community, a bit that people think it isn't an issue or isn't a problem. I mean, it's front and center in the States for sure, and we always go, well, it's not as bad as it is there, but I don't think that that's true. But I think there's this illusion that it's not even happening here sometimes.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, that captures it really well. The denial, the depoliticization of it, the displacement of it to say that, oh, this is an American problem, not a Canadian problem, or it's 2025, we're beyond that. We don't have that problem anymore. And those statements or comments are really dismissing the reality of what real experiences are telling us, and of course, what research is also demonstrating as well. So I think it's really important to have that context when we're looking at these challenges. Okay, I see a comment here from Kim. having 14 years of experience in Bermuda, and there is racism, but it's not as swept under the rug as it is here. And I think that idea of sweeping it under the rug is really important. And it makes it difficult sometimes to have spaces and conversations like this because it can be kind of an uncomfortable topic. And so the idea of sweeping it under the rug really speaks to the invasiveness and insidiousness of anti-Black racism, because oftentimes actually being called out as doing something that could be seen as racist is actually more problematized than the actual harm itself, right? Um, we also have to understand that it doesn't really do a service to try to label people in terms of being categorized, so to speak, as somebody that is racist, understanding that in this context, in this culture, in this society, all of us are informed by these problematic ideas and have racial bias. And so, what we're trying to do here is understand the roots of these ideas of racial bias and how they impact our engagement, and how we can be using critical reflexivity to be more aware of how we're engaging and how we're supporting members of the Black community and Black youth in particular. And so, to look at the evasiveness of racism in Canadian culture, it interrupts this discourse of multiculturalism. Canada actually is a beautiful country, right? This is not to say that Canada itself is a problematic country. This is to say there are areas to improve. And we do that by being honest with ourselves and by being sincere and looking at the gaps. And so while multicultural discourse is wonderful, there are still challenges with racial bias where we are not seeing the needle move in areas that so urgently need more attention. And that evasiveness and insidiousness is part of the issue, along with a depoliticized view that the challenges of racism are not really impacting us. And so Youth Rex did a study um, uh, in 2017 talking about the top 10 issues for Black youth and families in the Ontario context when it comes to encountering anti-Black racism. And of course, there have been so many studies in all of these areas where you're going to see some of the systemic sectors highlighted. For instance, you will see in number 4, the education system. You'll see 5, child welfare. You'll see criminal justice following that. There have been independent reports in all of these areas over the last few years that show discrepancy in disproportional outcomes for Black youth that hint to systemic and severe anti-Black racism taking place. You'll see studies from the Ombudsman, you'll see studies from the Toronto Transit Commission, you'll see many studies looking at gaps for Black and Indigenous community members and youth in particular who are targeted unfairly. And so having this context is incredibly important. And so, firstly, they looked at the widespread effects and reach of anti-Black racism and encountering anti-Black racism and everything from your daily school or education or workplace experiences to more structural institutional things. Let's say, for example, trying to rent a home and having some barriers based on the perception of your race being a barrier to that. Black excellence not being recognized, being invisibilized for some efforts, or being seen as the exception in terms of your contributions, and your race being the first definitive factor of how you are viewed and framed. Number 3 here, lack of Black representation in leadership roles. We see that quite a bit, especially in organizations and institutions that do primarily serve communities. We see that oftentimes, while there may be racialized staff in front lines, when it comes to more leadership staff, we do see some gaps in terms of representation. These are not one-off incidents. What we're doing here is referring to structural issues. And while it may seem a bit challenging, how am I going to solve structural things overnight? Well, that's not necessarily the goal, but the first piece here is to understand the root causes and to understand this widespread existence of anti-Black racism, to acknowledge it, and we can then start to unpack it and to dismantle it. So I did mention 4, 5, and 6 in terms of what's been found in those specific sectors: the traumatization of racialized policing, poverty and economic barriers, mental health supports, being lack of access, for example, and general well-being concerns for Black youth families and communities were all highlighted as major concerns in this report. And that information really informed the 5 grounding principles that YouthRex framed to move forward with its creation of the Centering Black Youth Wellbeing Certificate. So the first principle was affirming that anti-Black racism is real and leads to equitable access. And so, as we mentioned, that anti-Black racism can be evasive and insidious, there is a factor of anti-Black racism which makes you think, is it me? Was that a racist incident? Right? In terms of the Canadian context, where sometimes the culture is quite polite and being polite is elevated as a key value point for interactions, you start to question yourself. Maybe that wasn't really their intention, or if you come across an issue where you believe there was some racial bias, you start to question yourself. And so the first piece is affirming that anti-Black racism itself is real and is a real issue, and acknowledging the historical roots and the present day manifestation. So it's not something that's just existing in the past, it's also something that we're battling with now. And of course, that we're asserting that Black lives and futures matter, they're important, and we want to show up for our young people. We recognize that the experiences are multi-layered, intersectional, complex, right? I think that there's a part here which is like, what is our stake? What is our goal in addressing anti-Black racism? There are so many ways that people experience discrimination and inequity. Why do we focus on this issue in particular? That could be a common question. And I can agree that, yes, there are so many issues, and it's not about creating a hierarchy of who's in more pain or who is more oppressed. It's to also understand that all of these issues, yes, they do need to be addressed, but we also need very specific and very targeted methods for being able to address some of these social harms. And they are overlaying and intersectional. And so by centering Black youth, so by centering Black youth well-being, it doesn't mean that other voices and other communities are not centered. What I often say in this sense is that for those that are most marginalized, extremely in social context, they're so pushed to the margins. By centering them, it takes work. It's an active level of engagement to bring and pull the community voice back into the center. And ideally, what we want to see is everyone's voice in the center, everybody in the center. So for the most marginalized voices, we want to make that space to work collaboratively because we all have a stake in this. All of us do. And we want to be committed to centering the well-being of Black youth and communities through personal, professional, and institutional accountability. And so the kit for centering Black youth well-being has three aspects, three elements that we offer to you. The first one is an opportunity to learn from our 4-module certificate on centering Black youth well-being, which is a free online learning resource. We have the ACT component, which we have expressed through the call-in cards, which I'll explain a little bit more as well. This is an activity for people to use to have critical conversations about how we can call people in and have critical dialogue and self-reflexivity around instances of anti-Black racism in our working communities. And finally, we have the component of connection and networking and dialogue, which is expressed through our community of practice, through our virtual cafe. So we understand that anti-Black racism is a challenge that needs continuous investigation, but more than investigation, it also needs a continuous renewal of action, and it needs a commitment to be focused on ensuring that our efforts are both on a personal level and a social level. And so that ongoing reflection is not just about what our organizations and our workplaces are doing, it's also about us personally, what we are also instituting in our own practice, in our own stakes in the work as well. So the kit has the 3 components in terms of learn, act, and the dialogue component. All of these aspects are there to support us in unlearning things that we've come across in our daily work, reflecting critically, and committing to challenging and changing things going forward, again, on a personal and political level. So this kit was informed by focus groups. It was informed by our own in-house research. It was informed by stakeholders that shared with us some of the key aspects of things that they felt needed to happen to inform their work. What we wanted to find with the kit is a space where community partners could meaningfully share what was missing, what was needed to work against anti-Black racism in subtle ways and in substantial ways and impactful ways, and ensure that what we're doing is also action oriented. It wasn't just about checking a box saying that we've done the training. It was also about having the ability to show how we were incorporating the lessons from the certificate, incorporating the principles, and working towards measurable change and transformation. So the kit was informed by our in-house research and stakeholders, and it continues to be informed by that. And all of our modules in our certificate, in our virtual cafe, we pay attention to what's shared there to inform and improve the resources. So please take advantage of that as well. And so I have a couple terms here, and I would love to hear from those in the room if you've come across these terms, what they mean to you, and how you reflect on these terms, and if you've come across these terms in your work. So feel free to unmute or just share a comment in the chat. So the terms here are intersectionality, allyship, anti-Black microaggression, racial healing. Does anything resonate with you? Have you come across these terms before?
Yeah,
Hi, can I just like speak out?
Yeah, please.
Hi. I have heard of all of these terms before. I would say the most recent one to have language for was microaggressions because as a Black person, and specifically as a Black person in Canada, it can be, yeah, less of I've experienced the overt racism, but I think microaggressions occur most often, which is just like it's defined here. Mostly just like comments that make you feel uncomfortable, or like you said, kind of just like questioning whether or not you experienced what you experienced, because it can be kind of masked with pleasantries and sort of like kind language, but the undertone is discriminatory. So I would say yes to all those terms for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, absolutely. And for some people, framing it as microaggression seems to do a disservice to the harm. The idea is that these are very subtle and not necessarily vindictive slights, but when they add up, they cause great distress. But I would then argue that each of these so-called microaggressions is an aggressive and sometimes violent experience in and of themselves. And the challenge here in the context of, the Canadian context specifically is, again, when it's done with a polite tone or a well-meaning, I suppose, intention or presumed intention, it's hard to call it out. It's hard to feel validated in terms of understanding that this was actually a harmful instance. I see some comments in the chat as well. Rupali, thank you. Feel free to unmute if you'd like to share. I see that you're talking about affinity groups and larger groups. Do you have anything to share about that?
I think when I say affinity groups, thank you. What I mean is like how we have BIPOC support groups within organizational context, and then there are specific affinity groups which are attached to specific identities. For example, Black, African Canadian, Caribbean groups, where we often talk about racial healing in the context of providing each other or the folks belonging to that group or that community or identifying with that community that sense of support to restore themselves from the harm that is caused by the racial inequities in the systems. However, I often feel that those spaces are really, really important. And at the same time, it is really important to have those conversations in the larger context, because when we go out of those affinity groups is when racialized folks or Black or Indigenous folks is when they face those harm which are caused by their racial identities or by the microaggressions, which honestly, personally, I do not enjoy calling it microaggressions because the harm it causes is um, really twofold and compounded when experienced over time. So yeah, that's what I was, I think, trying to say with that.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I see a comment as well from, is it Jordan? Um, just having some appreciation for the concept of racial healing and a strength-based approach, emphasizing wholeness. And so, yes, lovely comments. And thank you so much again, Rupali, for sharing that. These terms are helpful. So intersectionality, of course, is talking about how bias can be not just based on one form of identity, but on multiple, and how that can create what's been framed as the matrix of oppression in terms of everybody, if I can say, everybody has areas of privilege and areas of oppression that they face in the society. And that it just means our intersectional identities are so complex and wrapped up. And for some of us, we may be experiencing multiple layers of intersectional oppression. You know, youth age is another one. And that's why when we're talking about centering Black youth well-being, there are so many nuances when it comes to addressing that. I see another comment here from Donovan. Ah, yes, excellent. Talking about intersectionality as well as a forefront, working with Afro-Indigenous students in the school board, having to live with both lives and two-eye perspective of life. Well, that's beautiful. The two-eyed theory or perspective is an Indigenous framework of being able to use that experience and being situated in those identities as a strength-based approach, which is really beautiful. Okay, thank you for sharing that. I see some more comments here, and please feel free to unmute. It would be great to hear from some of the participants here and to have some of this conversation. I see another comment here from Deborah, and I'm seeing some responses. People are loving the chat. This is great. Okay, this is interesting. So microaggression, for example, touching someone's hair without permission. So this has to do with someone's personal space and their body and respect. And so this is interesting. Referring to someone as half one race and half another can be seen as a microaggression because it reduces their identity to fractions as they are something to be divided and measured. That's a very deep one. When we're looking at I guess the impetus or the beginning of like racism as, I suppose, a social structuring mechanism was um, that was constructed within North American society. It's interesting that, especially in some cultures, race was literally about the so-called one drop rule. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with that, where if you had, one instance or one relative that was not white in your ancestry, you were then racialized. They had terminologies, hundreds of different terms to determine what fraction of racialization a person would have that would be equated with their level of privilege. And there was terminology that was actually very discriminatory that accompanied those categories. I won't go into that terminology now, but it's a very interesting point. Another comment here. I think it's also important to acknowledge that intersectionality is a framework that centers experience of Black women and compounding impacts of identity. So yes, Black feminism has been so important, and we can imagine that looking at patriarchy and racism combining was definitely an opportunity for the formation of these frameworks. Yes, Kimberly Crenshaw, who is associated with coining the term intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins, and other scholars that have really committed themselves to opening up our eyes around the importance of recognizing intersectionality. And when you looked at the third wave of feminism, for example, you saw that throughout all those waves, there was some progress made. And yes, there are many different types of feminism in terms of priorities or frameworks or paradigms. But when you were looking at the ability to access economic freedoms, etc., and for women to have the right to work, some women had been working consistently. And there were some dynamics within that framework that did not acknowledge those experiences of women who had experienced different realities. And so Black feminism opened a light on a lot of dynamics that were ignored and really paved the way for us to have these critical conversations, as well as the concept of uh, critical reflexivity that we'll return to as well. That's also a very rich framework. Situating yourself, positioning yourself. How do you enter the work? These are all really integral parts of that framework that inform our work. And so I do want to introduce the kit, the tools that we have in a little bit more detail before we conclude with some question and answer. And so the Centering Black Youth Wellbeing Certificate, it is a free learning opportunity. We have 4 modules. It begins with the context of anti-Black racism, talking about the history, talking about the different stakes that inform the formation of this certificate as well. We have engaging with research about Black youth. So we know that over 40 years of intensive research has been done on, Black communities in Canada and Ontario specifically. What's being done with that research? What's being done with those foundings? And we have some critical conversations about how we're moving the research into action, what we're utilizing when it comes to research as well. We have our critical practice for centering Black youth well-being. So when we're talking about mental health practices and challenging our own approaches, that is the 3rd module before we go to ongoing accountability and transformational change, which is our last module, which asks what can we do, again, individually and also structurally. Along with each of those modules, we have questions on our virtual cafe that are open to individuals to engage in discussions around anti-Black racism and centering Black youth well-being in their own practices and experiences. And so this is a way where you can now make the lessons live and talk about your own experiences. So please check out the links in the chat as well. This is not only tied to the certificate. The virtual cafe is always open, and we have a number of topics that are there. And so you're welcome to definitely check that out and engage in conversations. And in some cases, people have opened up their own conversations, and there've been some really rich conversations and chats happening there. And we have our calling cards for anti-Black racism. So this is actually a new feature, largely based on feedback that we got from participants who, again, were saying, it's great that we have the knowledge, we have their certificate, but we want to find more practical ways to move what we know into action and what we're doing. And so the calling cards for anti-Black racism action have 4 components or themes. There's Black youth voice, there's mental health and well-being, intersectionality, and allyship. I'll talk about these 4 points very briefly. And so there are 4 questions that we kind of want to reflect on when it comes to Black youth voice. And so how might we support the meaningful representation, engagement, inclusion, and belonging of Black youth? What are the strategies and processes for authentically centering and amplifying their voices and experiences? And every time I come to this slide, I always like to highlight the fact that this is not about giving youth a voice. It's understanding that they have their own voice. And with our position, with our potentially our privilege, with our access, we're there to amplify the voice. And so again, often Black youth voices are marginalized. How do we bring those voices into the center? And how do we leverage our own positionality to enable that to happen in a good way? Black youth mental health. We're going to ask, how might we develop practices, programs, and policies that merge mental health literacy with an intersectional and healing-centered approach specific to Black youth? And so when we're looking at a more wholesome, a holistic approach with some cultural responsivity as well, we have to look at how can we be as responsive and respectful and reciprocal to members of the Black community, understanding, of course, that it is very diverse. There's not one Black youth, there's not one Black youth or community, so to speak. It's so much diversity within the community. So we have to keep the complexity there. But by learning things like we've expressed in the certificate in terms of the historicity of anti-Black racism and racial bias, it helps us have the tools to be able to navigate through some of the challenges that young people and clients or community members may be experiencing in their daily work. And the calling cards just kind of help bring this into a very practical case study example where we walk through these scenarios together in a group and have that conversation. There's intersectional identities. So how might we center the whole stories of Black youth in our practices and programs? Again, so seeing the whole person. Maybe there are instances of someone we may not be able to see everything, but we acknowledge that. We acknowledge that we don't know everything and that everyone is different, and that we'll do the best that we can to understand that there are intersections of race, gender, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, religion, even this idea of colorism or pigmentocracy, if you will, shadeism, if you will. These ideas that even within racialized communities, there's also structures and hierarchies of oppression that are happening based on the ideology of anti-Black racism. These are all really important to note. And allyship is the last theme of the card. And we will ask here, how might non-Black allies, accomplices and advocates center the voices and experiences of Black youth families and communities? So again, how can we leverage our power and our influence to support Black youth and communities? And just returning to this point, what are some examples of things that we can do, or maybe things that we probably shouldn't do when we think about allyship? How do we become good allies? Any thoughts on this? Throw it in the chat or feel free to comment directly, but I'm just kind of curious about this one. Okay, I was just taking a quick look through the chat. Okay, so please feel free. Okay, listening and being open to unlearn. Maya, do you want to say anything about this idea of unlearning?
Sure. I was just thinking, like, there's a lot of there's been a lot of literature that I've looked at where it speaks to how we see ourselves as non-Black allies, but pushing our own agendas or still centering our voices over other voices. And so I think it's just recognizing that there is a lot we still need to unlearn before we want to move into an allyship role, for many of us anyway.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. I'll say that. Thank you. Anti-Black racism, again, it's a larger ideology that dehumanizes, um, you know, people of African descent. And that larger ideology doesn't just impact people that are not of the Black community, it also impacts those that are of the Black community, meaning that anti-Black racist ideas and actions can come from Black people themselves as well. And so this idea of unlearning is, it's everybody's responsibility because it's so widespread and it gets cycled that, all of us have a responsibility to question, challenge, reflect, and unlearn some of the things we've been taught about others and about ourselves, right? In Albert Memmi's book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, it's really situating the idea that our liberation is tied up in the liberation of others. If we are in a position where we're privileged and it's based on someone else's dehumanization, that actually dehumanizes us as well. And so this is the starting point of how we're all tied in this together. We are of the human race, and we've categorized ourselves in these racial tropes and these ideas. But really, to have a more just society, we have to unpack that. And that's another term that I love to refer to from Spivak called strategic essentialism. And that just posits this idea that you can understand how race is a social construct, and therefore not define yourself according to those constructs, except for the political strategy of aligning yourself with these identities to solve the problems that that they facilitate. So in other words, when I say that I am Black, strategic essentialism understands that, yes, that is a category, that is a social categorization, and I do align myself with that. But more than that, I'm also aware that that catchment that essentializes my whole identity is a social construct, but I align to it to be able to undo some of the framing that it tries to limit me in. And I'm sorry that my illustrations perhaps are not as clear, but these ideas, they definitely deserve a lot more space to unpack in terms of their meaning for understanding the social constructed nature of race and how they impact us, and how everybody has a stake in combating anti-Black racism. And as we're looking at supporting our Black youth as best as possible, utilizing these tools in critical ways. And so I see some more comments in the chat here. So using privilege and authority in work and spaces to advocate. Absolutely. And sometimes that means as well, there may be a colleague in the office that is constantly going up to bat and constantly doing the advocating, constantly doing the work. Is there some way that we can support that colleague in taking the burden off? Allyship isn't a label that non-Black people should give themselves. It's something that's shown through listening, learning, consistent action, absolutely humility, understanding that we make mistakes and there's discomfort and growing. Absolutely. It's not about the defensiveness, which is the whole point kind of this calling card activity, which is not being so defensive that we rob ourselves of the opportunity to learn and work through and make changes and shifts in our practice. So I'm seeing some great comments here. Regular reflective practice, excellent. To be clear about what is my stuff and how it might be getting in the way of authentic listening. Excellent. I see some great comments here. Okay. So there's a terminology, the term that we use really when we approach the calling card exercise is critical self-reflexivity. And I'm seeing that echoed a lot in the comments in the chat here, where we're talking about being aware, being conscientious of our own stakes, our own perspectives, our own ways, or is Shirley places it my stuff. And Shirley, if you'd like to unmute, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you define that as well. But yeah, I think this idea of critical reflexivity is key, not just in this exercise, but also in our work, being aware of our power, our privilege, our assumptions, being critical of our actions, and looking to move beyond our assumptions and improve our practices. And so when it comes to call in versus call out, there are some really practical ways that we want to reflect on when might be the most appropriate and effective way for taking either strategy. This, of course, does not mean that calling out is wrong or that there's anything that's ineffective or inappropriate with calling out. Sometimes calling out, meaning, it could be in a public way, it could be in a more direct form. Calling out racist action can be highly necessary. There can be urgency there, and you want to prevent further harm and make it clear that you disagree with what's being done. You may also not feel safe calling someone in, and this might be the only appropriate forum, and so you call someone out directly. Or perhaps you've tried to call someone in the past, and it's not been effective, and so then you feel calling out is necessary. And so there is a space in place and reason for calling someone out for offensive or racist behavior. But there's also space and opportunity for calling in where you feel that your conversation may be able to influence the individual to perhaps change behavior and that this could prevent further harm for others. You also might feel there's a sense of openness there. And so there is a call out guide from a study at Harvard University that we've also resourced there that you can check out. That kind of just helps situate context of this. And so when we think about calling in and examples of calling in and thinking about the whole theme of what we've spoken about, I wonder if there's anybody that wants to share like kind of examples that come to mind in your own practice and how this has worked for you. It could be within programs, it could be outside of programs. How have you approached calling in? And how has that worked for you? How have you seen it work? Please feel free to unmute if you'd like to chat, or you can comment directly in the chat as well.
I think I had an experience recently, and I'm not going to name with whom, but it was a person in a position of authority, and they said something which stuck with me, and it was stereotypical about a particular community, a racialized community, and it sounded like it came from a space of ignorance. In that moment, I think it impacted me personally so much I couldn't address it as well, but I went back to it and I met with this person one on one in their office space where it was just them and me. And I explained it to them. What first I reiterated what had happened and what has been causing. Like I've been thinking about a certain comment that they mentioned about a community and how it may have sounded and the amount of harm it potentially can cause, and the stereotyping of it can be harmful when they're approaching people or colleagues from that community. And then I think I had a conversation around intent versus impact. It was really hard for me, honestly, but and I feel like that's why I took a little time away from it when it happened in the moment. Um, Kind of prepared myself on how to address it, and then met with them one on one and addressed the specific comment and the harm that could have caused versus the intention with which it was being said.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I'm sorry you had to go through that experience, but thank you for sharing that. Um, it's a very powerful example as well. And there's another aspect there in terms of like what I'm hearing from you is that you took space for yourself because there's perhaps some emotional labor that you invested in that as well, and it's not easy. And so there is a cost in that sense, the emotional labor, the you know, anxiety or worry that perhaps this can impact the relationship with work colleagues. There are so many layers, and when we think about working together and collaborating and allyship, are there spaces where we're being cognizant of how emotional labor is balanced with our colleagues in the office and where we can step in and advocate and support in ways that don't always center ourselves. But the example that was shared is really powerful. And hopefully, what we see is a change in behavior with that gracious space that was created to bring attention to a harm that was done. And instead of, in that space where it's one on one, there's perhaps less of an urge to be defensive because you don't have the element of public embarrassment that's there to save face, where hopefully someone can feel a more sincere and genuine opportunity to reflect and make some changes. Thank you so much. Shine, is that a hand raised?
Yes, but there's so many people I just didn't want to randomly speak and interrupt somebody. I found, so I used to work at a cosmetic company and I was the comms and PR specialist, but I also helped lead the DEI committee. And so I had like a DEI book club, and I found that was like the perfect place to have conversations like this because we'd read books from Indigenous authors, Black authors, Asian authors, queer authors, like just from every sort of intersection. And we'd read it on like, we'd take like a month and a half to read it. And then I'd ask questions, like I'd send the questions beforehand, and then we'd just have a good discussion for like an hour at some point during or after work. And I would ask them about their experiences with like, with what you read. Like, have you ever experienced something like this? What do you think about the book and stuff? And people would openly like share and talk about their biases because they felt that safety and space of openness, and would talk about stuff like, yeah, I used to think this about this group, but then reading this helped me see this, or I had an interaction where this happened. And we were able to like actively like interrogate these things in a very, yeah, like safe space. Like it didn't feel like there was any judgment. It was more like, oh, like thank you for sharing that this is going on. And I think because that container was created, we were able to have some really meaningful discussions rather than it being just like a call out.
Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, that's a very practical approach to doing some great work. So thank you for sharing those examples. I do want to conclude this section just so we can open up to some comments and conversations, but I do want to show you an example of the calling card itself. So you'll see here, this is an example from the fourth set, allyship. And this set includes a scenario based on a real world situation. And so typically what we do in groups, and unfortunately, we obviously don't have the time today, but we do have physical cases with calling cards, and we do have these available online right now, and you're welcome to engage with them. But each of the four themes contain four cards with scenarios that are based on real world scenarios. And after you read through them, you go through four prompts. After, discussing with your group what's happening here, the assumptions that are being made and describing what's happening, and discussing any of the harmful impacts for Black youth, families, and communities, you then talk about how can you resolve the challenge that's being identified here? How can it be made right? And what can I do or we do to support racial healing? And so that's how these calling cards are situated. So a bit like Cheyenne was saying, in terms of creating a space for people to come together, that was a very constructive space. And, it probably felt like a safer space because people had committed to attending, to showing up, and they were engaged in the space. In this case, you may not be able to have that much infrastructure for regularly meeting with people, but you do want to have open dialogue. And we've seen this be adopted in a few organizations, and it's really helped to move things along in terms of just being able to facilitate some of these conversations that can be experienced as challenging often, in a healthy way, in a productive way, in a tangible way. So that is what our call-in cards look like physically. And I really encourage you to check out the website, take a look, and plan to engage with the material that we have. It's all free. We also, I mentioned that we do have the physical call-in cards. I believe we have a few left because we were mailing them at some point. I don't know if we have any limited edition. Katie would know. We might have some limited edition physical pouches left as well. But I want to conclude our overview of the Kit for Centering Black Youth Wellbeing there, and the floor is open to any comments or questions.
Well, thank you so much, Cyril. And I think that we have time for maybe one or two more questions or comments. There's a lot in the chat, so it's obviously a conversation that people really want to continue. But we do have time for maybe another question or a comment or sharing of experience. Okay, and just a lot of requests for the resources. So we can get those out. Yeah, just a lot of appreciation. So
I see a comment from David there.
comment.
If there's time, yeah.
David, go ahead.
So the whole topic of microaggressions is personally a challenging one for me because I know that I've been guilty of committing them. And it was interesting for me. A couple of years ago, I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers at the time, and a partner at PwC presented his experience with microaggressions, and he was a recipient of them. And he said he grew up not realizing that that's what they were, and he didn't understand the impact of them. So, like the kind of the lesson there was that you can be committing these, or you can be receiving them, at least in this gentleman's case, and not necessarily be aware of them. And my experience of that was I was talking to a good friend who was using language that I'm sure would be considered to be a microaggression, and I shared that with him, and he was similarly impacted by that. So it's challenging to look in the mirror and say, you've been part of this, and I guess there's growth in that, but it's easy to do, and so I want to thank you for this conversation. It's really a meaningful one, but I can tell you that it creates tension in me. I still feel that tension. So I guess I'm just sharing here.
Thank you, David. No, that's awesome. This is what we want to do. And I think that's really an important step, and if not the most important step, in terms of all of us having that critical self-reflexivity to see how we can do better. Because, you know, we might say something and yeah, we have the greatest intention. We didn't mean to be harmful, but for someone else, it registered a certain way and it could be harmful. And so to have that opportunity to learn from someone and to see something, that's beautiful. We're being human, and that's a humanizing process. And to talk about that tension and discomfort, it's not, we didn't create this society, right? That has created all these ways that people are dehumanized and devalued and there's inequity. We didn't create this. We find ourselves here and we navigate this together. And the more we do, the more work that we do to unpack and to be a part of humanization, I think the better. And so thank you, David, for sharing that.
Yeah. I think that's a really good note to bring our webinar to a close. So on behalf of everyone and the KDE Hub and everyone who was able to make time in their afternoon, I want to give you a really sincere thank you to you, Cyril, for such a powerful and a really meaningful conversation. And I'm taking away a lot. One of the things I'm taking away is just I really appreciated the context that you gave us around the structural and the societal elements that contribute and perpetuate racism. You also given us all, as you can tell in the chat, just pause to really reflect upon our own attitudes and behaviors and how different elements intersect, you know, that intersectionality that we need to be mindful of. And this quote that you said, you know, we all have a stake in this. Anti-Black racism isn't something that other people do. We all need to do this, and perhaps starting with that idea of unlearning as part of a critical reflexivity. And just to borrow what you said at the very end in response to David's comment that, you know, tension is okay because it creates a space to learn. And when we learn, we grow. So it's just some parting thoughts. I can't capture it all, but also just some really powerful knowledge products with the certificate, the virtual cafe, and the toolkit that are just really critical for us to learn how to support Black youth and really move our principles into action. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your knowledge this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
So at this point, we're going to ask everyone who was able to come today to, as usual, do a really short 2-question feedback survey. When you leave the webinar, the link will pop up, and if you could just let us know what you think of the webinar and any other comments that you would like. And on the very last note, I just think I have about 90 seconds to talk about this. We also want to talk about a toolkit that we have created here at the Hub to support your work. Thank you, Annetta and Megan, for popping that into the chat. So the toolkit's really designed to help those working in primary prevention communicate, like, what is upstream and what is upstream substance use prevention look like, and why does it matter? You know, what difference is this going to make? The toolkit is in 4 different parts. There's a slide deck. There's a video featuring voices from the field. There's a primer, and there's an animation on the river parable. So together, they work together, and they focus on youth substance use and how to communicate the importance of addressing upstream determinants of health, including what we just spent the last hour talking about around racism. So a link to that set of resources is going to be posted in the chat if it already hasn't. And I think I have 10 seconds. So just a thank you. This is our last KDE event for 2025. And we thank each of you for coming and helping us close off the year on such a meaningful note. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Please get some self-care in. I think everyone deserves that in the next couple of weeks. And we will see you 2026.